To stick to F-35, but step away from Elon Musk, there does seem to be a lot of criticism. And from someone who doesn't work in the industry, who's not an expert, it's quite hard to differentiate between how much of that criticism is actually legitimate. So, why does F-35 seem to attract a lot more criticism than fighter jets or military planes normally tend to get? And how much of that criticism is actually legitimate?
So, I mean, there's a few reasons why it attracts a lot of criticism. First and foremost, it's the most expensive weapon system ever made. If you look at the overall program, although it is by no means the most expensive individual weapon system, a B-2, for example, a stealth bomber, maths out at about $2.3 billion each. So compared to roughly $80 million for a base airframe of an F-35A and about $120 million for a full up, engine, software support, all of that included F-35A, nowhere close. But because of the cost of the program, and the fact that there were huge problems throughout its development, particularly with software complexity, and the fact that, as we mentioned before, that there were probably far too many different service requirements for different versions that ended up really complicating things. And there was also a decision to do something called concurrency, where they started building jets before they had completed some of the later kind of essentially bug fixing and development, which then meant that not only did they have multiple versions to deal with, but they actually also then had to retrofit a bunch of the early jets, and are still having to do that, for example, with what's called Technology Refresh 3, so TR3, which is the upgraded hardware to enable you to run some of the more advanced capabilities within the software blocks that used to be called Block 4 and are now actually split out into other things. And the result is the aircraft is significantly later than its original design promises, and continues to require costly and time-consuming retrofits and upgrades to chase the original very lofty performance promises and goals, which basically, when they were set, were beyond what technology could deliver. But they were set and promised in order to lock in commitment to the program from both US services and allies. And so, there are a huge number of things where if you look back at the F-35 program, if you could go back and start again, you would do a lot of things differently. And so for people who look closely at program management in a defense industrial context, they often really dislike the program because there's a load of things that they look at, like these are examples of what not to do. There's also a very, very strong, there's a body of people in the defense industrial space in other countries who make other jets, and also in the US to a degree for example, in manufacturers like Boeing who make other competing jets or used to compete. There's a strong dislike of the F-35 because of what it represents, which is essentially a very, very dominant competitor in the export space over multiple decades, and one behind which the US government has at times put a huge amount of political clout as well. And so, if you work in Dassault or BAE Systems or Airbus Defence and Space or Leonardo or Saab or Boeing, especially if you work in the overseas campaigns, so the export sort of competition bits of those business, the F-35 has been a problem that has kind of defined a lot of the challenges. It's not that nobody ever wins any other fighter exports, they absolutely do. But as I've said, where the F-35 is offered, because a lot of those exports for Typhoon, Rafale, Gripen, F-18, F-16, where they win competitions, it's generally where the country in question is not being offered the F-35, or incredibly obviously can't afford it. So, for people who are trying to maintain their defense industry in the air sector, who don't who don't work at Lockheed Martin or one of the subsidiaries that contribute to F-35, which of course BAE Systems, for example, contributes to F-35, as well as to Typhoon, and soon to be Global Combat Aircraft Program. So it's all interlinked. But basically, there's a body of people for whom the F-35 has been the main opponent, essentially, throughout their defense industrial career. And therefore, they will take any opportunity to highlight its deficiencies or bad news for the program because it helps with them. And of course, US fighter manufacturers, including Lockheed, would, some people in their export campaigns would sometimes, I'm sure, do similar things the other way of, because it's a competitive space and these are companies and countries and individuals competing for contracts worth billions and billions over multiple decades. And there's also just an element of it is because of the cost and the huge problems early on in the program. There are massive oversight and accountability mechanisms that the US government has put in place for F-35, which means that there is a degree of granularity of public information on the F-35's delays, issues, cost overruns, and the progress made to fix them. There is a degree of public visibility on that is not matched in any other fighter program, not even close. So, it is probably also fair to highlight that most other fighter programs are also late and over budget, and some of the things they said would happen didn't happen yet because the funding didn't line up, and the delays of whatever kind. There's plenty of examples you could point to in a lot of jets where things that were promised would be on the jet by now, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, are not on the jet, and very expensive to get there. But those programs don't have the Joint Program Office, the NAO oversight, the regular reporting requirements through Congress that F-35 does. And so you see a lot more of the F-35's programmatic issues than you do on other jets. What you don't see is the operational benefit side of it. So, I've been lucky enough to fly with fourth generation jets, flying both alongside and then against F-35s as part of a wider exercise. And flying with it, from a different country as well. So it's not perfect integration in this particular example that I saw, but flying with it, you get utterly superb situational awareness and support. Anytime that something is engaging you, generally speaking, you will be warned by various mechanisms by the F-35 pilots or by the F-35s themselves. And so you are much more aware than your own sensors would enable you to be in a fourth generation jet if there's an F-35 operating in the package with you of any threats. So you can adapt to them and respond to them much, much earlier. They can provide electronic warfare support, so degrading enemy radar performance at critical moments to, again, defend both themselves and potentially defend other fourth generation assets that are in the same package over relatively short range. And it depends, there's a whole host of dependencies on that, but it's very impressive when you see it done. And the same goes the other way for fighting against them. You might get ghost echoes sometimes, depending on the system that you're operating. We couldn't see anything, but in terms of where the F-35s themselves were. But even if you can get rough indications, we knew they were in the area anyway. You as a radar, operating a radar, when there are other things that you can see, you can't just ignore the things that you can see because you know that there are stealth aircraft there that you might be able to get a ghost echo on once in a while. So you're left with either trying to focus on finding the things that are really hard to see, in which case you don't have nearly the capacity you need to deal with the things you can, or you focus on the things you can see, and the things you can't see, i.e. the F-35s, kill you. And even when you do get weapon solutions on, as playing the enemy in this case, on some of the fourth gen things that we could see, you start being on the receiving end of those F-35 electronic warfare capabilities, as well as, of course, their missiles. Uh, and they're not invincible. Um, you know, they can be shot down, as anything can. B2 can be shot down in exercises in specific circumstances. But the the level of capability that it brings operationally is just in a different class to traditional fast air. And what's more, it the F-35 capability set complements existing fighters, so the traditional non-stealth fighter sets, so well, because where the F-35 has limitations, which are chiefly it's relatively difficult and expensive to maintain because it's complicated, and the global supply chain was well, the production of new aircraft has been prioritized for a long time industrially over production of spare parts. So what you have is global shortages of spare parts, and so for a given fleet size, you will typically see less F-35s actually flyable on a given in any given moment for a given amount of money and people that you put in, which again leads to criticism. Rightly, it's funnily enough actually really quite cheap to buy now compared to most other jets. So the economies of scale have got to a point where actually the F-35 is actually cheaper to acquire in most cases now than competing non-stealth jets, but it's much more expensive to run and to maintain. So there are limitations there, which mean that generally speaking, you won't see as many F-35s in the air as other things. And if they're trying to be stealthy, which is kind of their thing, then they're carrying all their weapons and fuel internal, and so weapon loadout will be significantly lighter than theoretically you might see on a multi-role jet that's non-stealthy. So a Typhoon or a Rafale or whatever can all carry more stuff generally. Although it's notable that generally when you're flying around in exercises, all the multi-role jets aren't carrying much other than fuel tanks anyway. So in exercises, you're also dealing with fast jet, traditional jets that are not suffering the weight and drag penalties that they would actually be suffering if they were loaded out with standoff missiles or bombs plus fuel tanks plus air-to-air weapons plus a targeting pod. So the comparison is not entirely fair. But basically, that additional weapons load, visibility, ability to broadcast on radar without worrying about giving themselves away because they're already visible, that you get with traditional jets, F-15, Typhoon, Rafale, Gripen, F-16, complements the stealthiness, the electronic warfare stand-in capabilities, the fantastic situational awareness that even a small number of F-35s can bring to that composite package, and vice versa. They really do complement each other. So, for example, in the Royal Air Force, we find, because we have the F-35B with RAF and the Royal Navy, and also the Typhoon, which is a kind of classic traditional jet. It's kind of magnificent as an aeroplane, but it's not subtle. But they call it the thug and the assassin. So the thug is something you have to respond to. It's there, it's loud, it's banging away with lots of radar energy and really long range missiles and quite a lot of them, and you can have quite a few in the air. And that makes it really difficult to deal with the F-35s, the assassins that are a little bit further forward, that have better situational awareness and can also deliver weapons effects, but also EW. And dealing with the two in combination is much, much harder than dealing with a greater number of either one of them on their own. And so, it's an enormously capable system. And because of classification issues, most of the public debate on F-35 does not include or see why countries keep buying it and why air forces love it. Because actually, what it offers operationally in a high threat environment just can't be replicated with any other competing system. You can potentially accomplish some of the effects using other jets, but to do so, you would have to use far more jets with far more standoff munitions, with a lower probability of kill, therefore launched in larger numbers with a higher risk appetite, and more air-to-air munitions also launched at longer range. So you functionally would, for example, end up using I don't know, $30 million of standoff munitions per sortie, per pulse, to accomplish the same weapons effect terminally that you could accomplish with a small number of F-35s and a couple of standoff weapons or stand-in weapons, depending on the threat, and offensive fighter cap. The counter argument to that on the F-35 side is that what most fast jet fleets spend most of their time doing is not going into high threat missile engagement zones from Russian or Chinese ground-based air defense systems and high and fast air. Instead, what most jets spend their time doing is quick reaction alert and territorial defense and contributing to multinational stabilization or counterinsurgency operations or whatever, traditionally, over the last 20 years. And for those things, you don't need an F-35 really. So you could flip it around and say, well, actually, particularly for nations that struggle with money, as all nations do, but to a greater or lesser extent, so maybe air forces that really struggle with money, you could make the argument that it's better to have the thing that is what we call minimum viable product, the traditional cheaper to operate jets in larger numbers that can fulfill your day-to-day tasks, and then invest in lots and lots of standoff munitions as a stockpile in case you ever need to go and do the high-end thing, which, yes, will then be much more expensive to do for a given effect than if you had F-35, but you hope you never have to do it. If countries were sitting on huge stockpiles of standoff weapons, relevant to that suppression and destruction of air defenses task, then that argument would hold. But countries aren't sitting on huge stockpiles of standoff weapons, so except China.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.